Haiti is in crisis after the assassination of the country's President Jovenel Moise last week. The country's interim prime minister and Senate president are now struggling for control as investigators search for the motive behind the attack. Haiti is asking the U.S. and UN to deploy troops in hopes of stabilizing the situation. The Biden administration said on Saturday that there are no plans to put boots on the ground there. Joining us now with more is Catherine Porter. She is a foreign correspondent with the New York Times. Hi there, Catherine. So the last time a Haitian president was killed, more than 100 years ago, U.S. Marines occupied the country for nearly 20 years. In this case, we just heard that President Biden's unwilling to put U.S. forces there at this moment. But what type of assistance has the Biden administration offered?
Well, it seems that the Biden administration is willing to send investigators to help with this investigation into who killed the president of Haiti. We understand that they've announced that FBI and DHS agents will be going to Haiti shortly to help with an investigation. So far, that's what the commitment has been. We have not heard, the Haitian interim government has been asking for military presence to secure the country, they say, and to secure infrastructure right now and allow elections to go forward. But there is no appetite, it seems, from the White House to do that. And rightly so, I have to say. I mean, it's very interesting. There is this history in Haiti of the United States appearing in forms of troops, sometimes welcome and sometimes not.
And so far, 2 Haitian Americans have been arrested in connection to this plot. What more do we know about them and any possible motive for the assassination?
All of this is really quickly, the story is changing minute by minute, it seems. So we don't know that much more about them. So far, one of them we do know was from South Florida. He seemed to be a technical engineer, electrician of types. We knew that we've been told that he had been in Haiti for a little bit of a time, and that he had had a contract with the Canadian government working in the past at the embassy and security. We're still learning more about him and his other colleague about what they were doing in Haiti, but they seem to have been spending some time there. The justice of the peace that interviewed them told me that they had said they were simply translators and that they had not been in the room when Jovenel Moise was shot, if in fact they were shot by his group. There are lots of rumors swirling in Haiti about who actually did this, and a lot of uncertainty among people there as to whether this narrative is as clear as it's been painted at this point.
Yeah, and Catherine, have we learned anything more about any of the other suspects? Or, as you say, there's a lot of rumor, there's a lot of innuendo, but is any understanding about why this took place or who could be behind it starting to emerge at all?
So far, no. I think we have to be really careful reporting this. There are lots of rumors. Haiti is a country where people, it's called telejol. It's a rumor mill. It's really thick. Lots of people are very frightened to talk because of what happened. So I think it's going to take us a while to get to any truth in the matter. And it's great that investigators will be coming to help with that. We don't really know yet exactly what happened. We do know that some of these Colombians were, in fact, in the military. We're really, the story is changing, it seems, every hour right now. And I think it will take a little bit of time for us to unpiece what really happened there. Certainly, the government has been clear that they believe that these men are the ones who killed Jovenel Moise. But many in the country are still questioning, where were the police? Where was his security? How come they got through so easily? This should have been a very fortified home. What really happened that night, and what were they doing there? These are all questions that, I think it will take more time for us to carefully come to conclusions.
Catherine, one of the other big questions is who is in charge. What can you tell us about the likeliest people to take control, and why is there no functional government in place?
Well, the government has two chambers. The the terms of the lower chamber completely expired a year ago, and 2/3 of the upper chamber, the Senate, also expired. So as it stands now, there are only 10 senators who are elected members who are sitting. It's a really weakened, state because of that in terms of the governance of the country. And up until the moment he was killed, President Moise was ruling by decree because there was no sitting house. Now there seems to be a real power struggle going on between who is in charge. The interim prime minister, who who had only been in the role for a few months because the former prime minister had stepped down. He before that was the foreign minister. He has said that he is in charge. He is the prime minister running the country, that he should be there with his fellow ministers until there's an election. The senators, 8 of them, have stepped forward into the breach. They put out a memorandum saying that they've nominated the president of the Senate, and that he should be the interim prime minister, because just to make these things even more elaborately ornate, a couple days before President Moise was assassinated, he had nominated someone to replace the sitting interim prime minister, and that was to happen this week. So, and this is a country that has 2 constitutions that say different things, one in French and one in Creole. There is a lot of confusion what will happen, and I think if the United States, when a delegation comes, we have to watch really closely as to who they meet with, who they deem to be the leaders of the country. The United States has huge sway in the politics of Haiti, as does what is called the core group, including the Canadian government, the French government. So I think the role of the international community and who it agrees with, that is in charge, will be telling over the next couple days.
All right, Catherine Porter, thank you.
Thank you very much.